As it always happens, the catastrophe began completely unnoticed and long before the crisis. An old bulk carrier, once serving the mining settlements of the asteroid belt, had broken away from the quarantine station. The shoddy welding work and neglect of regular inspections had caused one of the fastening arms connecting the bulk carrier to the station to snap. The ship lost alignment. The oscillations began to accelerate relative to the station's center of gravity, and eventually, the remaining 5 arms burst one after another like drugstore rubber bands trying to hold a heavy dumbbell swinging on them. The central processor at the quarantine station dutifully sent a report of the accident to the service center, but the station was 16 light minutes from the center, and by the time they got the report, the bulk carrier was already gone. No one had expected that any of the old ships docked at the quarantine station's asteroid could suddenly run away, and the station's automation couldn't calculate the fugitive's course. The technicians of the center sent several probes to search for the bulk carrier, but there was almost no chance of finding the old vessel. The probes were to reach the scene only in 2 weeks, when the volume of space to be searched through would exceed all the capabilities of the search team. So the technicians gave a warning about the lost ship to the Navigation Committee of the Solar System, got their legal reprimand from their superiors, and forgot about the incident. On the scale of the system, the bulk carrier was a speck of dust, and the quarantine station was located in the middle of nowhere, far from any regular routes. The chances that the runaway ship would end up in a busy traffic zone were negligibly small. Then came the war with the Eularians, and everybody forgot about an old decommissioned freighter lost somewhere in space. But the bulk carrier survived. It didn't fall into the sun or any of the giant planets. It didn't fly away into the void, but by some unique coincidence, it entered a comet orbit and became one of the numerous bodies of the solar system. With one correction, nobody knew about it. Its orbit, velocity, and mass were not calculated and entered into the Navigational Committee's logs. Still, the chances of its trajectory dangerously intersecting with something before the inner planet's observation systems could detect it were vanishingly small. But still, not zero. "Captain, sir, you must see this." Philip DeLoyne put aside the book he was reading and looked at the man who had entered the bridge. For passenger mate Hein now, it was his first voyage aboard Zealand, but he had been flying as a passenger mate on Solar United ships for several years now. He would hardly bother the captain of a large liner over nothing. "I'm listening," Philip said, looking at his subordinate expectantly. Hein handed him the service tablet. "Perhaps I'm worrying for nothing, sir, but I thought you should know. This is the passenger list. Note the number 146. Philip took the tablet, scrutinizing the lines of small print. The usual list. Names, brief passenger details. What could be so unexpected that an officer should suddenly burst onto the bridge with a worried look? A popular music or movie star traveling in disguise? A controversial politician? A religious figure? Unlikely. Celebrities are frequent guests aboard system liners, and Hein had probably encountered such people before. What else could there be? The military and police stopped using liners long ago, and even if they were to transport a dangerous criminal on a passenger ship, they are legally obliged to notify the owner company and, of course, the ship's captain. Okay, number 146. What do we have here? Zuman Adbochast. God, what a name. Philip had seen passengers of many different nationalities in his career, but this was the first time he had ever seen such an exotic name. Let's check where this Bokhast was from. The passenger number 146 was listed in the column Nationality as ULL. Philip scratched the bridge of his nose. What the hell was that? It was the first time he had ever come across such an abbreviation. Some new political entity of the outer colonies? But if it had been recognized as a subject of international law, it would have been in the news bulletin, and Philip wouldn't have missed it. ULL. He looked questioningly at Hein, again marveling at the extremely worried expression on his mate's face, and then it hit him. "Oh shit," said Philip, setting the clipboard aside. "We have a Ularian on board?" "Yes, sir," Hein nodded. "So far, he's staying in his quarters and keeping to himself. But if he decides to take a walk, you understand, sir, there could be trouble. I'm concerned for the safety of the passengers." There was no need for extra explanations. The 4-year war with the Ularians had left a permanent scar on the public consciousness. Even though the population of the inner planets in the solar system had remained almost unaffected by the conflict, the outer colonies and the fleet had taken the brunt of it. The propaganda efforts had not been in vain. Tales of the ruthlessness and cruelty of the Ularians raised the degree of hatred towards the enemy almost to the point of instant boiling. It had been 6 years since the end of the war, which had ended in a catastrophic defeat for the Ularians, and passions had subsided somewhat, but if people saw a real Ularian in front of them— Philip sighed. He wasn't sure how he would behave if he saw a recent enemy. He had served in the Second Strike Fleet during the war and participated in liberating several colonies captured by the Ularians. He knew that the propaganda did not exaggerate the facts. On the contrary, sometimes it softened them. "How did he even get aboard unnoticed?" he asked, immediately realizing the question's absurdity. The automatic control system checked the passenger's identity against the documents presented, not his social status or citizenship. Officially, the Earth Confederation and the Uluri conglomerate were on relatively peaceful terms, and there was no reason to restrict the movement of citizens within each other's territories. Ulurians were generally humanoid, so loose hooded clothing was enough to disguise them on the way to their quarters. The Ularian was probably taken through customs and border control at the passenger terminal by security, away from the public's eyes. Damn, they could have warned him. Philip felt a wave of irritation, but quickly suppressed it. What was the point of wasting his nerves on this now? He'd have his say when he got back, both to Solar United and to Venus Delta Terminal Security. "What do we do, sir?" Hein's voice snapped the captain out of his gloomy musings. We'll increase surveillance on the quarters of that— what's his name? Bokost, in case he ever thinks of taking a walk. We can set up additional micro cameras in the corridor, sir. If he goes out, we'll know right away. The system tracks whenever a cabin door is opened, but it's counting the room service too, so it's not really effective. Just stay out of the cabin. We don't want a diplomatic scandal if he detects the surveillance. Philip got another idea. And here's another thing. Every Ularian traveling through Confederate territory must have an official escort. This escort was unlikely to be marked as such on the passenger list, but he is probably stationed in a neighboring cabin. He picked up the tablet again. Let's see. One cabin is empty. By the way, this Ularian has no shortage of funds. Those are double suites. Aha, here, Andre Mustaine from the— He looked closely and raised his eyebrows in surprise. New Hope? New Hope was one of the planets that had been occupied by the Ularians the longest. Nearly half the population had died there. I didn't expect to see somebody from that planet as an escort. Anyway, please invite this Andre here. I need to talk to him. But keep it quiet. I think he'll understand. Yes, sir. The officer nodded and went out. 6 days remain until Zealand arrives at the Neptune transfer terminal. He wanted to believe that the damned Ularian would sit still in his quarters during that time and not cause a riot by showing up at the restaurant in the middle of the evening show. What the hell was he doing here? And why hadn't anybody bothered to warn the ship's captain that he had a social time bomb on board? Philip didn't yet know that none of this would matter very soon. By another coincidence, a software glitch occurred in the processing unit of the long-range scanner of the Zealand a few days ago. This glitch caused an avalanche of errors, which eventually led to the fact that the scanning data of the entire sector ceased to be received by the navigation processor and the central control terminal on the bridge of Zealand. Instead, the same 2-day-old summary began circling around the circuits, showing space clear even of micro-meteorites. So the scanner sensors that had spotted the old bulk carrier on a collision course with the system liner were sending their information nowhere. It fell into the data processing unit, looped by the glitch, and died quietly there. The sensors had done their job. These primitive devices, of course, didn't care what would happen with their data after they transferred it. There was not much time left before the collision of two ships. Andre Mustaine turned out to be a woman. Philip had not expected this. When Andre entered the briefing room, where meetings with customs and other officials of ports and stations were usually held, he was somewhat confused. It seemed natural to Philip that the Eularian's escort could only be a man, preferably a heavily armed commando. However, Philip immediately realized the absurdity of this assumption. It was impossible to bring weapons aboard the ship. No tricks would help. But still, a woman. Andre's handshake was pleasant, warm and confident, but without trying to prove anything. She was thin, rather tall by Earth standards, about 40 years old, with blonde, short-cropped hair and a hard look in her brown eyes. Judging by her age, Philip figured that she must have survived the Eularian occupation as an adult, whether she had been part of the field resistance, the city underground, or had spent all that time in a concentration camp. He hesitated to ask, lest he inadvertently say something tactless. Most of the survivors of the occupation did not like to talk about those years. "To be honest, I expected you to contact me sooner," Andre said. Philip didn't let the fleeting annoyance show on his face. "I would have done so," he said, "if I'd had the slightest idea that there was a Eularian among the passengers." Andre squinted at him. "If you had known that we had bought tickets for your flight, you would surely have found an excuse to keep us off the ship. I assure you, the Eularian poses no danger to the other passengers and crew." "I wish I shared your confidence," Philip said dryly. "But given the circumstances and, let's just say, some personal experience, I can't." Andre sighed. "You've been in the war, haven't you?" "Yes," Philip answered briefly without going into further detail. "Second strike, right?" Andre pointed to the small badge on Philip's tunic. Normally, members of passenger ship crews were not supposed to wear military insignia and decorations, but there were some exemptions for higher officers. Philip appreciated her experience. Not every colonist knew much about naval insignia. "I saw you on East 4th during the Liberation Parade. We moved there from New Hope as soon as the quarantine was lifted. It was too hard to stay." Andre shook her head. "Captain DeLoyne, I'm officially stating that the Eularian you have on board is no more dangerous than any other passengers." "And unofficially?" Andre shrugged. "Unofficially, Captain, you realize I didn't just end up accompanying Bocast for no reason, right?" Philip shook his head slightly. "Zuman belongs to the Order of the Discarnate. It's a new... No, you can't call it a religion. It's more of a philosophical movement, gaining popularity in the conglomerate. Its adherents are calling for a radical change in thinking, a rejection of the old way. Do you know what the old way is?" Philip nodded. "All for the benefit. A simple motto, the quintessence of the old way, the predominant philosophical and religious system of the Eularians. It was to be taken literally. Everything that existed in the universe was to be used for the benefit of Ularian civilization. Accordingly, anything that could not be used was to be destroyed. The humans were fortunate to have encountered the conglomerate at a time when they were outnumbering the Ularians by hundreds of times. Ularian history books describe at least 2 cases of total obliteration of useless civilizations. The journey Zuman is undertaking is a pilgrimage of sorts. He has already visited all the inner planets, and now he wants to visit each of the belt worlds and then the outer colonies, Andre said. It's as important to him as, say, the Hajj to Mecca is to Muslims, or visiting the Blue Moon is to Neophysites. But most importantly, he has had part of his median gland surgically removed. Zuman is simply physically incapable of violence. Philip stared dumbfounded at Andre. Memories about the Ularian stormtroopers, whose reaction and strength were dozens of times superior to human ones, still sometimes gave him nightmares. The Ularians owed much of that superiority, as well as their incredible cruelty and tendency to solve all problems with violence, to a complex hormone that remotely resembled a super-powerful version of adrenaline, which was produced by the median spinal gland. For any Ularian to voluntarily agree to have it removed, impossible. "Suppose I believe you," he said finally. "But that's only part of the problem. The other, much bigger one, is the other passengers. If they find out that there's a Ularian on board, I can't predict exactly what will happen, but it won't be good. You won't be able to explain anything to them about peace-loving religion and removed glands. You'll probably be torn to pieces along with the Ularian before you can say a single word." Andre smiled as if she had heard some old, but still successful joke. "Then it's up to you and me to make sure no one finds out about this, isn't it, Captain?" She stood up. "As it seems that we have no other choice." When she left, Philip sat in prostration for a while. Ularian on ship. He'd much rather have discovered a large shipment of drugs or some homegrown terrorists on board. However, Andre was right. They have no options. He would put cameras at the entrance to the cabin, of course, and he probably must relocate the passengers from this sector under some pretext so that it would be possible to shut down the whole sector if needed. Even Ularian can't get through the emergency bulkhead. But damn it, it's amazing how calm this Andre woman is. Though for a moment, when she talked about moving from New Hope, Philip had thought something had flashed in her gaze, something black and creepy. But it was washed away by her pleasant smile. He didn't have time to finish the thought because a giant, invisible hand pulled him out of his chair and, like a rag doll, threw him against the wall lined with light-colored plastic. The growing snowball of coincidences and failures was rapidly rolling to a conclusion. The bulk carrier looming inexorably toward the Zealand remained invisible to her systems almost to the very end. A few minutes before the collision, it was finally detected by the auxiliary detection systems. But the processor went the wrong way. It studied the data, a considerable object weighing several 100,000 tons, which appeared as if by magic from nowhere, compared it with the results of observations for the last few days, where there was nothing close to it, and wrote it off as a random failure in the system. Only at the very last moment did the watch navigator pay attention to several strange messages about program failures, manually bypass the analytical blocks of the navigational processor, and put the data from the scanners on his screen. When the meaning of the numbers reached his consciousness, he was petrified with horror for a moment and, therefore, had no time to press the alarm button or call the captain. However, both of these actions would have made no difference. As a final gift of mercy, fate decided not to throw a 1 on all 5 dice simultaneously. The bulker hit Zealand tangentially, thanks to which both ships did not instantly turn into a single cloud of burning debris. The angular frame of the old ore carrier plowed diagonally through the elongated hull of the passenger liner, leaving a terrible but still not fatal wound, and rushed on, slightly changing the orbit, which, as a result, will someday lead the bulk carrier to fall into the sun. On the other hand, Zealand continued on almost the same course. Neither the navigational processor nor the engines had been damaged, so the automation made the necessary corrections almost immediately to prevent random rotation, and the slightly off course could be corrected later. Inside the liner, people were beginning to feel the shock. Philip came to his senses from the acrid odor that made his throat scratchy. His head was buzzing, and his eyes were watering desperately, but all his bones seemed intact, and he could think relatively coherently, though he still had no idea what had happened. Maybe the Ularian was a saboteur and had tried to blow up the liner, he thought wildly. But it was a stupid idea. In theory, it was possible to sneak explosives on board, but certainly not in the quantity that would cause such consequences. The source of the odor was a bluish haze billowing from the ventilation grate. It wasn't smoke. There was no smell of burning. Most likely, some piping had burst somewhere, and something had started leaking into the ventilation system. Now, until the source of the leak was identified, he could only hope it wasn't too toxic. Philip jumped up and rushed to the bridge. Anything not anchored to the floor or walls now rested against the opposite wall from the bridge entrance. A few paces away, the watch navigator shook his head, standing on all fours, alive and seemingly unharmed. Good. Philip jumped to him, but the officer waved him off, and the captain rushed to the main control panel. The scale of the disaster became apparent just a few seconds later. Some object comparable in mass to the Zealand had literally demolished the upper deck and badly damaged the next two. The energy core and engines were intact, which was good. Philip thanked the conservatism of shipbuilders who, even years after the war, continued to place the captain's bridge in the heart of the vessel, even on civilian ships. However, it was a small consolation because the top 3 decks were reserved for the cheapest cabins and were traditionally the most densely populated. A cold sweat broke out on Philip's forehead and back at the realization of how many people had died there, but he forced himself to chase away the instant despair. There would be time for grieving later. Now it's time to rescue the survivors and help the wounded, who would probably number in the dozens, if not hundreds. Philip reached out to call the medical section on the intercom. He froze, staring in horror at the blinking red light. The recovered navigator typed a command on his terminal at that moment, and a holographic projection of the liner appeared above the control panel with a preliminary assessment of the damage. A massive laceration was crossing the Zealand askew, and the spot where the sick bay had once been located was in the middle of this monstrous rupture. During the last ship refurbishment, it had been decided to move the doctor's domain to the most populous part of the liner, the second deck. The next half hour demonstrated that the endless training and drills had not been in vain. Even the passengers, at first terrified and anxious, became imbued with the discipline and firmness of the liner's crew, and the rescue quickly took on a well-organized character, as much as was possible under the circumstances. Philip had no time or energy to express his pride in his subordinates, but he promised himself that he would do his utmost to see that they were all honored in the future. But that was for later. First things first. The situation was not hopeless. As far as it was possible to reconstruct from scraps of data, some ancient ore carrier built many years before the war had crashed into the Zealand. It doesn't matter now where it came from, but it was clear that it was a typical ghost ship, and that, having done his black work, it continued to nowhere. So Zealand was in no further danger. The primary energy core and engines were unharmed, and the ship retained control. But the casualties were nightmarish. According to preliminary estimates, about 300 people had been killed in the strike, and about 100 more were missing. Philip feared that most of them would also end up on the mournful list. The wounded were numerous, mostly with fractures, bruises, and contusions of internal organs, and not a single doctor could be found among the passengers. Unfortunately, if there were any on board, they were among those directly hit by the bulk carrier. Of course, the liner's personnel had taken first aid courses, and most of the crew could handle relatively straightforward tasks, such as treating simple fractures, minor concussions, and cuts. However, there were still at least 2.5 seriously injured, and the number grew as the rescue effort expanded to the most damaged parts of the ship. They were all being taken to one of the restaurants, hastily converted into a makeshift hospital. Philip had ordered that all the small first aid kits and all the medical supplies in possession of the passengers be collected and delivered there, leaving only vital drugs and supplies for the people. A volunteer pharmacist from the passengers sorted through this flood of headache pills, birth control medications, antihistamine aerosols, and antibacterial patches, but it was woefully inadequate. Worst of all, several of the wounded, clearly suffering from internal bleeding and other severe trauma, needed urgent surgery, or they might not live to see the following day. "Try to interview the passengers again, including the wounded," Philip said tiredly to the third mate, who was in charge of the hospital. "There may be someone familiar with medicine. I don't care if it will be a dentist or a hospice nurse. Anything would do. Otherwise, we'll either have to watch people die in our arms or become the surgeons ourselves, with instruments from the engine room." He knew there was little hope, but saw no other way out. Philip disconnected and allowed himself a moment's pause, although the intercom was flashing with many lights waiting for his response. It was a quirk of fate. He had been through the entire war and served on the long-range cruiser Poseidon, but had first encountered the consequences of direct hit only now, in peacetime. And it didn't matter that it wasn't a Eulerian torpedo, but a rogue ghost freighter. The rules were the same: prevent panic, organize rescue efforts, and maintain discipline. There were other veterans among his subordinates and among the passengers too, for sure. That must have helped. If there had been chaos and disorder, things could have been much, much worse. His attention was drawn to some confusion at the bridge entrance. A sentry posted by regulation at the door was trying to block the way of someone who wanted in very badly. Of course, it was not a Marine, as on warships, but a cadet with a stunner, which he probably didn't know how to use. So a few moments later, Philip jumped up with his hand on his holster to meet the two who had entered the room. The Eulerian's narrow, long face did not flinch, even when several guns were pointed at him. He only raised his hands slowly, turning them with open palms toward Philip, a universal gesture demonstrating the absence of weapons and peaceful intentions. The movement made the ample sleeves slip down to his elbows, exposing forearms that seemed to be coiled from steel cables. Philip knew that a Eulerian could rip a grown man in half with his bare hands, and their skin was capable of deflecting many things, including medium-caliber bullets. Eugenics had been Eulerian state policy millennia before they developed genetic engineering, and they had wasted no time. "Please." Andre stepped forward. She had a large bruise on the left side of her face. Obviously, the disaster had taken her by surprise as well. Zuman and I want to help. There's no danger, I told you, Captain." Philip felt his finger tense on the trigger of his blaster. If the Eulerian will attack, he'd have time to put at least a couple of charges into the alien. Earth stunners worked on Ularians, but with far less effectiveness. The question was what the woman would do in the meantime. The Ularian blinked. Philip saw a stiff horn flap slide from Ularian's brow, move downward momentarily, and then retract back up. This flap was even stronger than Alien's skin, and he could change the composition of the moisturizing fluid secreted by the glands hidden in the grooves to neutralize any poisons in the eyes. "We heard you needed doctors," the Ularian said. "We can provide assistance." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion, his narrow lips barely open as he spoke. "It is important." Philip didn't understand what the Ularian's last line referred to. Was it important to the ship or Dumont himself? But he didn't care. "Are you a doctor?" Philip asked, still aiming his blaster at the Ularian. The Ularian shook his head. His race didn't actually have a direct gesture of denial, so he'd borrowed it from humans. And for humans, his own people simply wouldn't understand him. Interesting fact. "No, but I can do some surgery. I possess the proper skills." Philip saw a flicker of horror in the cadet's eyes. To the young man, the Ularians were a nightmare from his childhood. Monsters on the news. Demons to be driven back to the hell from which they had escaped. But anyone who had been through the war and encountered Ularians in person knew that for all their ability to inflict terror, Ularians never lied. There was no such concept as lying in their civilization. True, no one believed them anyway, but there was no choice now. "You'll work in an isolated room, behind locked doors," Philip said, having made his decision. "If we suspect foul play from your side, we'll just pump out the air, and you mustn't be seen. If people discover that the surgeon is being replaced by a Ularian, I can't guarantee your safety, or ours, to be honest." "I understand," Zuman said. "I'm ready. It's part of the new way." Philip thought quickly. The Ularians were far superior to humans in reaction speed and precision of movement, including fine motor skills. That might compensate to some extent for their lack of experience, but the anatomy of the Ularians, despite their outward resemblance to humans, was very different. They weren't even mammals, though they had a similar metabolism and could eat Terran food. Philip shuddered at the last thought, but forced himself to get back to the point. "Do you need any surgical manuals? Manuals of human anatomy?" "No," Zuman said. "I know anatomy. I don't need anything." "I'll assist him," Andre said. "I learned some of those skills too, on New Hope." Philip noted that her voice sounded even more impassive than the Ularians. "I'm afraid we don't have the tools either," he said. "Everything was destroyed along with the sickbay. All we can quickly gather are utensils from the galley. We can get ultraviolet lamps and clean tablecloths for sheets. We can arrange for anesthesia. There are some suitable medication in the first aid kits." "That'll do," the Ularian said without moving. Apparently, he had not yet mastered the gesture of assent, a nod. "Where to go?" "Wait here while we prepare the room," Philip answered. "Then my men will escort you out, so you won't be seen by anyone." He looked intently at Andre. "I hope you won't let us down." "It's the way of the Order of the Discarnate," said the woman. "We can't fail." Philip didn't understand what she meant. What did she have in common with some strange Ularian philosophy? He was only able to observe the first two patients. When Zuman picked up the fish-cutting knife, all the knives were additionally sharpened, but they still looked like ordinary kitchen utensils, and bent over the first patient. Philip could barely restrain himself from storming into the former vegetable pantry that had been converted into a surgical unit and firing a full blaster clip at the Ularian. However, the alien, working clearly and quickly, with Andrea's help, opened the patient's abdomen and sutured up the partially damaged spleen without damaging any other organs or major blood vessels, and the captain relaxed slightly. After the second surgery, on a patient with a complex tibia fracture, Philip returned to the bridge. 3 days later, the first rescue ships approached Zealand. By this time, the Eulerian had performed surgery on 16 people, all of whom had survived. He worked almost non-stop, only occasionally drinking water and once asking for food. Andre assisted him for nearly 24 hours straight, then passed out. She just collapsed, barely stepping out of the room, slept for 10 hours, then woke up, had a snack, and went to assist Zuman again. Philip knew that in the future, he would have to explain his decision to the commission investigating the crash's circumstances and the crew's actions, but that would be later. Unfortunately, a few people still died before they got a chance to get to the surgery, and every decision on who should be treated immediately and who could wait would stay with Philip forever. An hour before the rescuers docked at Zealand, the Eulerian and Andre had finished the last surgery, and they were escorted to their quarters just as discreetly as before. Philip personally shook hands with both the woman and even the Eulerian, managing not to show the deep-seated, almost instinctive terror and distrust to the alien. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "That was a well-done job. Without you, almost all of these people would probably be dead." "Part of the atonement," the Eulerian said. "It was necessary, especially for me." Philip hesitated. "Speaking of you, you said on the bridge that you had proper skills, even though you weren't a doctor, but you didn't specify what it was. May I ask what your specialty is? Biologist?" He knew that the Eulerians made no distinction between the study of sentient and non-sentient species. Birds and humans, for example. The horn flaps slid down and up. "No," said Zuman. "I was a cook in the Blue Fleet commander's kitchen." He stepped back, and the door to his quarters closed before the meaning of those words reached Philip. "Oh my God," said the crewman accompanying them, one of the engineers and a war veteran, then bent in half and vomited directly onto the lush carpet. Philip looked at Andre in horror. "And you knew all this time? God, how could you? It was the Blue Fleet that was standing on New Hope. Why would you accompany this monster?" The woman met his gaze, and in her eyes, Philip saw an abyss of hell, a darkness like he had never seen before, not even in the darkest moments of war. "Everyone has his own way of redemption," she said in an even voice. "Why do you think I was so good at assisting Zuman? I possess proper skills as well. The Eulerians were very good at suppressing the will of slaves, and then assigning them jobs they didn't want to do themselves." She looked straight into Philip's eyes. "I was Zuman's main supplier," she said. "I worked at the meat factory.